Okay, so here we are. This is the resource identifiers file that we added just near the end of class. And this is where the problem I was having originated from. The issue with this file is that it's kind of bridging the game and the game engine. We have some identifiers, the class scoped enumeration texture ID. Those are names of things in our game. They're part of the game, so they don't get the JEX namespace. However, the type defs that I was doing, so the type def for the the forward declaration for the resource manager and the type def for the texture manager, so I can just use the word texture manager instead of having to write out resource manager, angle bracket SF texture, comma texture ID. That's the resource manager is part of our game engine, and so that's in the GEX namespace, so I have to use the namespace. So I've put those things in JEX, and now I don't have any of those problems. So just to review what's in this file right now, I have a forward declaration of the SFML, so namespace SF, texture class. And I need that because I use that in my type def. I also have my enumerated class texture ID. That's the other thing I use in my type def. So those two things I need because I'm using them in my type def. My type def, I'm forward declare. First, I'm in JEX. The other thing I need is the resource manager class itself. So this is a redeclaration of that, a forward declaration. It's a templated class. It takes two parameters, a resource and an identifier, and it's called resource manager. So that also is a forward declaration. And all of that is so I can do this type def, which is to declare texture manager to be of type a resource manager managing SF texture with texture ID. And I also, by adding the texture ID enumeration in here, I bring that in whenever I bring in the resource identifier. Okay, so that was the issue I was having with trying to define my aircraft. Okay, so if you fix that up, and then if we go to our aircraft.h, I'm including resource identifiers. And so now I have aircraft, which is going to inherit from GEX entity. Notice using the, I have to use the namespace scope because aircraft is not in the game engine, it's in the game. And now my constructor, which takes two parameters, a reference to a texture manager object and an aircraft type. So the first one, the aircraft type, that's from the enumeration that's at the top of this file. So that's there. The next thing is this texture manager object, and that's what's forward declared and the purpose of the resource identifiers file. So, and I have to use the JEX namespace here because all that stuff is in the JEX namespace. So here is my aircraft constructor. It takes two parameters, an aircraft type, which is this enumeration defined right here, and the other parameter it takes is a reference to a texture manager object. And what a texture manager object is defined in that, it's what we just looked at in the resource identifiers.h. I also have two members. Now, SF, one is called _Sprite, SF Sprite. I've moved it to public for now. It's an interim step. It's going to go back to private in a few minutes, but it's here so that we can access it from the game. Later on, we're going to make this drawable and add a virtual method that override for draw and then Sprite will go back. But for now, just so that we can see this intermediate step, it's public. So my aircraft is going to have a Sprite, and the member name is underscore Sprite. And my aircraft is also going to have a type. It gets that from the constructor. And it's called underscore type. So now we have to go and look at the aircraft constructor in the implementation file. So we did this convenience function or helper function in class. This takes a aircraft type and maps it to a texture type. So I take a aircraft type identifier, and it will return a texture identifier, so I can then go look up that texture in my texture manager and use it to define a texture for my sprite. And so now the construction is very simple. I do it all in initialization list. I initialize the type to be type, and I initialize the sprite. Here I am using rather than using set texture, there's a one argument constructor for a sprite where I can pass a texture to the sprite, and it will construct itself with and set its texture to that. So I'm using the texture parameter that's passed in to my texture manager, and I'm doing get, and I'm getting the texture ID for whatever the texture that belongs to that sprite is. So I use the type of the airplane to get a texture ID, and I use the texture ID to get a texture, and that's the texture I use to set the sprite. Okay, so that's all of our aircraft and our resource identifier done. So the next thing is to look at the game. Okay, so I'm going to have to make my player a pointer. So I want to make my player a aircraft. The reason I have to make it a pointer is because I don't have I haven't defined a NOARG constructor for an aircraft object, and so therefore I need to, and I can't actually initialize that aircraft object until I have a texture map, and I don't get a texture map until later in the construction process. So the way I'm going to handle that is my player member is going to be a pointer to an aircraft object, and this is just temporary, so I'm not going to worry about using smart pointers. We're just going to use a naked pointer. Okay, so that's the only change I had to make here. The only change I had to make was to redefine underscore player as now being a pointer to an aircraft object. The other thing that I did change is I used I didn't change it. I'm still using, the other thing I could change is I could use my new definition of a texture manager. Oh, pardon me, I did use it. So I'm using that type def. So remember, we have texture manager type def to be, there you can see it, it's gex resource manager of texture and texture ID. And so in order to use that type def, I've included resource identifiers here. Okay, so we pop over into game. I don't have to, I've removed underscore player from this initialization list. I have to load my textures before I can, because I need to have that texture manager in order to instantiate aircraft objects. And now so I load a texture in, and now I create my player object. So remember, this is underscore player is now something that can hold a pointer to an aircraft. So I new up an aircraft, I pass it the type eagle, and I pass it the name of my texture manager, which is underscore textures. And there's one other change I have to make. So right now, player is not a sprite. It's not drawable. It's an aircraft, and an aircraft has a sprite. So everywhere where before I had underscore player dot something, like for instance here I set the or I get the bounds. Before I had underscore player dot get global bounds. Now I have underscore player pointer sprite get global bounds. So that's referring to the sprite that the player contains. So everywhere you have player in game, you have to replace it with that. And again, we're going to fix that in the next iteration, but it's important to go through this step so that you see the intermediate step. Okay, and that now loads and works, and it even works with, I'm using the 3-image texture, so you can see it banks like it should. Okay, so the next video will be a review of the entire project so far, and the video after that we're going to add to player. We're going to make player drawable so that we can overload the draw method and we don't have to refer to the sprite, and then we can move the sprite back into the private location.